20 years ago, Panorama investigated a bungled murder inquiry that resulted in 3 innocent men being sent to prison for life.
Innocent! You know that they're lying. You know police have told them what to say.
Last year, the case against 8 officers accused of perverting the course of justice to secure those convictions collapsed.
And frankly, if people had written a work of fiction about this, they wouldn't have believed it. But this is fact.
The reputation of an entire police force has been shredded, and tonight we reinvestigate what is becoming the biggest scandal in the history of British justice.
This is the largest scale of injustice in a single case, certainly in my working lifetime.
I am returning to Cardiff on a cold case review I first covered for Panorama over 20 years ago. It's a journey into the past with purpose. To reinvestigate a tale of murder and a major miscarriage of justice. I wanted to know how it was that last year 8 police officers involved in that miscarriage had walked free from court when the case against them collapsed in dramatic and controversial circumstances. First stop in a city that's changed almost beyond recognition is to meet a man I felt I knew only too well, but remains a stranger. At the age of 33, Tony Paris was serving a life sentence for a murder of which he was innocent. He was in Wormwood Scrubs when the television programme was transmitted in February 1992.
After the Panorama programme, one prison officer said to me, "What are you doing in this prison?" I said, "Well, I told you I shouldn't be here." Because that's when I realised people are now listening.
The story begins at number 7 James Street in the heart of the Old Docks area with the murder of 22-year-old Lynette White, a well-known prostitute.
She was a very pleasant girl. I mean, she was only, I think, 20 then at the time. But she was very pleasant and well-liked.
The killing was exceptionally and unnecessarily brutal. Some 49 stab wounds and her head almost severed.
I think she had her throat cut more than once because it was a very ragged wound. And probably after that, she had multiple stab wounds.
The senior duty officer in Butetown that night was then Inspector Dick Powell, who immediately became involved in the investigation. And he and the police team had an early and powerful lead. Witnesses had seen an obvious murder suspect right outside the house within hours of the killing. An actor played the suspect, a lone white man, when BBC Crime Watch featured the Lynette White case 5 weeks after her murder.
The man seen virtually outside the flat that she used to take clients to must be the prime suspect.
He certainly is a person who we must speak to at this time.
He remained the major suspect for months as the investigation continued, with the South Wales Police drafting in their most experienced officers. They included Inspector Tommy Page, described to me as the CID's top detective and in the vernacular a renowned thief-taker. By September, 7 months after the murder, the day-to-day investigation was taken over by Inspector Graham Mouncher. Today, the case notes in the Lynette White file run to over 1 million pages. A review of the investigation shows that when Mouncher took over, he was still focused on a single white male line of inquiry. And now he was convinced he had a prime suspect christened Mr. X. But 2 weeks later, the investigation against the suspect ended abruptly when forensic analysis on the blood in the flat ruled him out. The detectives were right back to square one. When the case against Mr. X collapsed, the story took a turn that almost defies belief. For 9 months, the police had been looking for one white male suspect, and that line of inquiry now became history. Suddenly, in a series of dawn raids across the docks, a completely new set of suspects was taken in for questioning. There's a knock on the door at your home.
Yeah.
Cops come in.
Yeah.
And they say,
John, can you come to the police station with me? I actually said, are you taking the piss? You're looking for a white guy. What are you troubling me for?
John Actie was known in Cardiff Stockland as a hard man, and not without reason. I'd met and filmed him 20 years ago, but now, at last, he agreed to talk openly to me for the first time. And when you're charged with a murder, what's going through your mind?
I couldn't believe it. It was horrifying. It was unbelievable.
Also arrested was Tony Paris, again a Bute Town man known to the police, but only with minor convictions for shoplifting.
I was panicking because, as far as I'm concerned, they're not listening to me, and they're trying to convince me that I was there.
That's a chilling moment for you.
It was. That was really the start of the reality that they wasn't going to let me go.
And along with Tony Paris and John Actie, the 3 other men arrested and charged were John's cousin Ronnie Actie, Yusuf Abdullahi, and Lynette's boyfriend Stephen Miller. Based on flimsy evidence from a tip-off, the police had come up with a scenario in which all 5 men had somehow come together on the night of the murder. They then made their way to Lynette's flat and, without motive, had taken it in turn to stab her to death. This bizarre story leaned heavily on the testimony of 4 key witnesses. They included Leanne Vilday, a Bute Town prostitute and friend of Lynette White's, and another local prostitute, Angela Pasila. The police had interviewed both women on a number of occasions, and both women had insisted consistently they knew nothing of the murder. Then suddenly, after 9 months, they changed their story.
She was talking to me and
Now, they said they'd heard screams from the flat. They said they ran over to find Lynette being attacked. The 2 other main witnesses were Mark Gromick, who lived above the murder flat, and Paul Atkins, who was with him that night. Both men are gay. Like Vilday and Pasila, they too changed their story on a number of occasions, and they too settled for a final version that seemed to implicate all 5 men in Lynette's murder. This version was then taken and presented to Stephen Miller, who after 13 hours of denials in his interviews eventually agreed he was in the flat.
At that time, I think Leanne came in. She started shouting. She ran out. Then after that, all I had to do was Toy just went crazy, man. So I started stabbing. You know what I mean?
Following the longest murder trial in British criminal history, John and Ronnie Actie were acquitted with unanimous not guilty verdicts. The remaining 3 defendants, Stephen Miller, Yusuf Abdullahi and Tony Paris, were all sentenced to life in prison.
Innocent!
You're a convicted murderer, you get life, you phone your wife.
Well, I just told her that I don't know when I'm going to get out. And so the best thing to do is to divorce me. There was too many people in prison getting Dear John letters and killing themselves. I had enough of my plate worrying about me. I couldn't worry about what was happening outside.
20 years ago, when I first visited Cardiff, I was puzzled at the police adopting a new scenario so quickly and suddenly, accusing 5 mixed-race men with no forensic links to the crime, without motive, and based on evidence from deeply unreliable witnesses.
These girls, these prostitutes, you know, they was vulnerable. They were street girls. They're vulnerable. You don't get them more vulnerable than that.
5 people. You all had alibis?
Yeah.
None of you had a motive?
Well, motive? No. We wasn't there.
Right?